The world is on edge, and nearly every headline feels heavier than the last. A sudden, ferocious escalation in the Middle East has altered the geopolitical landscape overnight, drawing in global powers, impacting markets, and rattling ordinary people from Tehran to Tokyo. The situation is unprecedented in years, and few media moments captured that tension as powerfully as when Joe Rogan, one of the most listened to voices in modern media, addressed the crisis on his podcast in a way that instantly went viral. Over the past days, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran in what officials have described as Operation Lion's Roar, a sweeping military offensive targeting strategic sites across Iranian territory. These attacks marked a dramatic turning point, intensifying decades-long tensions over nuclear capability, regional influence, and mutual deterrence. Reports indicate the strikes hit air defense installations, missile infrastructure, and leadership targets deep inside Iran, igniting swift retaliation across the region. Global powers are scrambling to respond, and urgent calls for de-escalation have poured in from world leaders. When Rogan took the mic, the conflict had already become a defining moment in international affairs. But for many listeners, news networks felt saturated with instinctive opinion and alarm, not explanation. Instead of hysteria or slogans, Rogan offered what he called context, the why behind the headlines. His long-form breakdown didn't just summarize events, it traced the strategic, historical, and economic pressures that have brought the world to this fever pitch. Rogan started with history, not as a textbook lecture, but as a foundation for understanding the present. He reminded listeners that US-Iran rivalry did not spring up overnight. For nearly half a century, mutual resentments, shifting governments, covert operations, and competing regional alliances created layers of distrust between Washington and Tehran. What is unfolding now is both a consequence of that long arc and a radical leap beyond it. He spoke in plain terms about Operation Lion's Roar itself, how and why the US and Israel moved from years of indirect pressure, sanctions, and fragmented conflict to direct military action. According to multiple sources, this offensive involves a vast array of weaponry, including precision airstrikes, missile barrages, and coordinated airborne operations designed to shock and degrade Iran's defense and command structures. While officials framed the campaign as defensive and necessary, Rogan was careful to underline the real stakes. Once a sovereign nation is bombarded from the air, the risks of escalation multiply faster than most people realize. But the immediate trigger, he explained, is only part of the story. The political negotiations that preceded the bombing, diplomatic efforts mediated by Oman and others intended to halt Iran's nuclear ambitions, had already collapsed without compromise, setting the stage for confrontation. Rogan then shifted from origins to implications, drawing a picture that gripped listeners across the ideological spectrum. He explained that modern conflict is no longer linear. It is a network of interconnected pressures, economic, military, political, and psychological. It's not enough to count missiles. You must also count incentives. Iran, he said, is not a simple adversary. It is a complex state with asymmetrical strengths, ballistic missiles capable of regional reach, militia networks embedded across neighboring countries, a strategic choke point in the Strait of Hormuz that anchors half the world's oil shipments, and a political class hardened by decades of sanctions and isolation. The discussion that reverberated most was his explanation of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which nearly one-fifth of global petroleum transits every day. Rogan explained in stark terms that conflict here is not just military, it's economic. Disruptions can send oil prices soaring, increase shipping insurance premiums, and cause supply chain shockwaves far beyond the Middle East. By the time he finished, listeners were not only thinking about missiles, they were thinking about global inflation, food prices, and energy security. He didn't ignore the human cost either. Reports now confirm that the conflict has already claimed lives on multiple fronts, including the deaths of US service members and civilians across the region caught in crossfire. Iran's retaliation has included missile and drone strikes against US bases and allied nations in the Gulf, and hundreds of casualties have resulted on all sides. The global diplomatic reaction has been intense. An emergency session of the United Nations Security Council saw the US and Iran trading accusations, with international leaders warning that the violence could spiral into a wider war. Some nations condemned the strikes as violations of international law, while others urged restraint and a return to diplomacy. Throughout his monologue, Rogan emphasized that every actor in this crisis is calculating risk differently. For the US and Israel, The stated aim is to prevent a nuclear-capable Iran from threatening regional or global security. For Iran, survival and deterrence are existential priorities. For global powers and middle states, the fear is destabilization on a scale not seen in decades. He warned that once one side feels cornered, escalation ladders, steps from limited confrontation to full-blown war, are easy to climb and difficult to descend. That silence between actions, he said, is where miscalculation often thrives. This part of his analysis struck a chord internationally, not because it offered certainty, but precisely because it acknowledged uncertainty. People are anxious not only about what has happened, but what might come next. Rogan's breakdown went beyond military hardware. He talked about cyber warfare, information disruption, and the psychological warfare that accompanies physical conflict. In modern engagement, he argued, power isn't just projected through bombs and missiles. It's contested through data networks, financial markets, public perception, and international alliances. By the time his 3-hour episode concluded, Rogan had unpacked the conflict not as a distant geopolitical event, but as a multi-layered crisis with repercussions for millions of people around the world. He didn't pretend to have definitive answers. He acknowledged the fog of war, but he did lay out the why behind the world's anxiety, because this is not a contained skirmish between two nations. It is a fracture that intersects with global energy supplies, with long-standing grievances, with great power politics, and with the uncertainties of 21st century warfare. And that's why the episode went viral. Not because it offered clickbait or dramatics, but because it translated a complex, frightening moment into something people could understand on their own terms. In a media landscape awash with sound bites and hot takes, Rogan's detailed conversation stood out as rare. A calm, contextual, and deeply human look at why the crisis between the US and Iran has the world on edge, and why every policy shift, missile launch, and diplomatic silence feels so consequential to so many people right now.